to have you with us in every way. Now, if I can get myself organized, I'll be ready to go. Just a minute. I'm just curious, how many of you here have read the book, The Da Vinci Code? Handful? How many have heard of it? That kind of makes a point in a way, and for those of you who listen to this maybe later on tape, only about 3 or 4 people had read it. Everybody had heard of it. I'm reading it now, and it's truly fascinating to watch an ancient pagan cult attempt to rise again. Because in the real sense, that is exactly what's going on. More, I think, than most people who have even heard about it, or even the people who have read it, realize. The book is creating its own cult following, but it really isn't new at all. You may know that Dan Brown, the author of the book, was sued for plagiarism by, I think, the authors of Holy Blood, Holy Grail. And he won, or they lost, or whatever. But the fact is, I think he plagiarized from so many sources, nobody's ever going to be able to nail him down. There is nothing whatever new in the original premises. It's borrowed from this or that, quote, scholarly, end quote, source. And the one thing you need to know about scholars, if you don't like this one, they're like city buses. If you don't like this one, just stay where you are, and another one will be by soon going the other direction. So you don't have to worry too much about that. Another element in this is how a work of fiction can be taken as fact in some quarters. Believed, almost like fact. Now, the first and foremost important thing to know about the Da Vinci Code is it is fiction. Capital F-I-C-T-I-O-N. It is fiction through and through. It is not historical fiction. It's fiction. And to explain what I mean, have you ever known someone that you would say had a veneer? You know, you scratch them, you find a little different kind of person underneath the veneer. Well, I had a friend once. We were apt to say of this friend that if you peel off the layer of veneer, you'll find another layer of veneer underneath it. He is solid veneer. He was veneer all the way through. And that's how it is sometimes with people. Well, by analogy, the Da Vinci Code is fiction all the way through, and it combines another form of fiction, and we call them conspiracy theories. And conspiracy theories can be counted on to enliven almost anything and to create a following regardless of how bizarre the conspiracy is. Just Google conspiracy theories on the website and you won't have any trouble finding examples of that. Someone said as she read through the book, she constantly found herself doing internet searches to find out if the things being described in the book were really there. I laughed because I had initially found myself doing the same thing. For example, I forget the name of the church in Paris, but I did not realize that before the Greenwich Meridian, what became the zero meridian recognized around the world, zero meridian was in Paris. It was the Paris meridian. And in this particular church, there was a copper thread that goes right down through the church where the old Paris meridian was. In the book, it becomes a brass thread. And a lot of things are built up around this. And it goes on with all sorts of things. There are things in it that I did not know, but frankly, I have not found anything yet that I felt confident trusting. It's one of those things you absolutely have to go look up and see if this is really true, if you think it's worth it. Now, one of the ideas developed in the book is the assumed suppression of what is called the sacred feminine. It's an old idea, but it's found a lot of repetition in literature. It is squarely in the Bible as well. The suppression of the pagan feminine is a very strong biblical theme. Now I went up on the web again, and I found an interesting site called Teen Witch, which that's not like sandwich witch. It's as in witches and wizards witch. Teen Witch, which is sobering all by itself. But anyway, they had an article on it titled Asherah. Asherah is the original bread of life, they said. Hebrew and Canaanite women molded loaves of this figure, which were blessed and ritually eaten, the precursor of the communion wafer. Now, It most assuredly is not the precursor of the communion wafer, but this is the way people build this sort of thing up. It is precisely the way that Dan Brown has built up his ideas. Really, he presents them in his book as the ideas of the characters. I have no idea what Dan Brown thinks. It's almost impossible to sort that out from the book. You just have to work through his characters. But they come up with these things that are almost manufactured out of whole cloth. It's a theory. It's an imaginary idea they come up with and create. Anyway, they say it's the precursor of the communion wafer. Her idols were found under every green tree, were carved from living trees, erected as poles or pillars beside roadside altars. This is true. Crude clay images of her as tree of life later evolved into the more refined Syrian Artemis. And if you go around very many archaeological sites that deal with the Mideast, looking at little pictures of this, that, and the other thing, you'll find again and again and again this feminine form cupping both breasts in her hand out toward the person. And it is an obvious representation of an Asherah, of Artemis, of the female sex goddess, which came down to us today as Astarte, or more recently, Easter. Ancient sexual rites, dismissed to this day by male scholars as cult prostitution, associated with worship of Asherah, ensured that matrilineal descent patterns with their partnership rather than dominator roles, you can hear a little feminism in that, would continue. Hebrew priestly iconoclasts finally uprooted Asherah, supplanting matrifocal culture with patriarchy. Our Judeo-Christian inheritance of this law of the Levites, passed on by the Roman Empire, would you believe, is one source of present-day sexual inequality. Now, I don't know how old this posting is. It sounds like the idea was borrowed whole from the Da Vinci Code, but hey, it may be the other way around. It may have been borrowed whole from some other source from which the Da Vinci Code also borrowed it. Now, there's some truth in this, which is often the case, in that when you go through the archaeological remains in the Middle East, you find all sorts of these little clay figurines of what are called Asherah or Astarte. They're everywhere. I've seen them in every museum I've visited, I think, just about that has to do with that, from the British Museum to the Santa Sofia in Constantinople, all the way down to the Egyptian museums. She is everywhere. What is not generally understood, I think, is that all these nations in the Middle East all had their pagan deity. They had, for example, one had Moloch. The Sidonians, I think, had Baal. You have Moloch, Baal, Dagon, just a whole, pantheon. But they are by nations. They're not just a heavenly pantheon. Each nation had its singular god. What is curious about this is every one of those gods had a consort, and every one of those gods had the same consort. Her name was Ashtoreth, or, Asherah. And so we have this female, this sacred feminine, as they call it, throughout the Middle East. In fact, there was an article appeared in Biblical Archaeology Review not that long ago, titled Yahweh and His Consort. And you will actually find that there were Israelites. This shouldn't come as a surprise if you've read much of the Old Testament and seen what God has to say about this. There were Israelites who worshipped Yahweh and Asherah, both, assuming that, like she was the consort of every other god, she was the consort of Yahweh. Yahweh had a wife in the eyes of a lot of Israelites in the Old Testament. And those of you who have read the Da Vinci Code will already begin to hear overturns of that based upon what Dan Brown is trying to present to us in his novel. Now, this persistence of this goddess is incredible when you think about it. It is true that Hebrew and Canaanite women did what they said here. In fact, you may be familiar with the scripture. It's found in Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 16. Jeremiah 7:16. God says to Jeremiah, "Do not pray for this people. Don't lift up a cry or a prayer for them. Don't make intercession to me. I will not hear you. Don't you see what they are doing in the cities of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem? The children gather wood, the fathers kindle the fire, and the women knead dough to make cakes for the queen of heaven." Asherah. This is where this all comes down to. And, of course, what they are saying is they formed these cakes. They baked this bread in the form of the Asherah, of the female goddess, and then they ate her, as it were. He says, don't they provoke me to anger with all this sort of thing? Do they not provoke themselves to the shame of their own faces? Now, we know all too well that the Israelites, when they came into the land originally, were supposed to drive out these people and not adopt any of their religious customs. We also know that they didn't pay close attention to this and that they did adopt many of those customs. By the way, that same article, while it showed, it made an interesting point. It says any of the excavations that are done in Palestine, in what was Israel at one time, showed these pagan goddesses by the dozens, by the score, all over the place, prior to the exile in Babylon. Any ruin, any excavation for the period that is post-exilic has none of them. So it's fairly evident that they learned their lesson by that Babylonian exile and did not go back to the worship of Asherah after that period of time. So to that extent, Teenwich was right that the patriarchal system, as they would put it, won out. But the truth is that the Jews finally listened to God, and God won out. Now, what we read in Teenwich is really what I would call the whining you would expect from a people whose God lost the battle. You know, they make excuses. They try to explain away what has happened, and it really is whining in its approach. But the persistence, anyway, of this fertility goddess is awesome. Even among the refugees that went down into Egypt at the time of the final Babylonian invasion. You may know the story of how Jeremiah was tucked away in the prison. The Egyptians came in and took the country, and when they did, they found him in prison and let him go. And Jeremiah, along with a gathering of people, finally went down into Egypt to get out of the area entirely. He wasn't the only one that went down there, because before, when the Babylonians were coming in, a lot of Israelites ran. They got out of Jerusalem, they went down, they crossed the Nile, they went into Egypt to be safe from the Babylonians. Okay, God speaks to Jeremiah concerning all the Jews that fled out of the land of Israel into Egypt. It's in Jeremiah chapter 44. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, you have seen all the evil that I brought upon Jerusalem, upon all the cities of Judah, and behold, this day there are desolation, nobody lives there anymore. Okay, have you all got the picture, folks, he says. There's nobody there now. You're down here, the rest of them are in Babylon. Because of their wickedness which they have committed to provoke me to anger, in that they went to burn incense, and to serve other gods whom they knew not, neither they nor your fathers. That was a totally new thing for them. Howbeit, I sent you to my servants, I sent all my servants the prophets, sending early and sending them, saying, oh, don't do this abominable thing that I hate. Now, I can't think of very many stronger ways that this could be said. God says, oh, please, don't do this thing. I hate this thing. It's an abomination. Now, what is it about it that could possibly have been so bad? What is so terrible about what took place? Jeremiah 44, verse 5. They didn't listen. They didn't incline their ear to turn from their wickedness, to burn no incense to these other gods. Wherefore my fury and my anger was poured forth and was kindled in the cities of Judah, in the streets of Jerusalem. They're wasted as this day. Now here you have to ask the question, what? Do you mean this is merely because these people went over to a pagan shrine of some sort and burned some incense there? That's all that's involved in this? No, that's not all that's involved, as we will see. Therefore, saith the Lord God of hosts, the God of Israel, why do you commit this great evil against your souls, to cut off from you man and woman, child and suckling out of Judah, to leave none of you behind? Okay, what have you done? Why have you done this thing? You provoke me to wrath with the works of your hands. You burn incense to other gods in the land of Egypt, where you've gone to dwell. You've gone down there, and you're doing exactly the same thing that you did up there. You're still making that same stupid mistake. Have you forgotten the wickedness of your fathers, the wickedness of the kings of Judah, the wickedness of their wives, your own wickedness? You've forgotten all this stuff? Now, I can see some people reading through this and saying, what? They burned incense on an altar to a grove somewhere? What's the big deal here? Why does he indict everybody with wickedness for the things that they have done? More to it than that, isn't there? I mean, anyone would say there's got to be more to this than that. He says they're not humble to this day. They still are not afraid. They still haven't walked in my law or my statutes that I set before your fathers. Now, what's interesting about it, the people who were carried off into Babylon repented. They came back in a wholly different spirit. The people who went to Egypt did not. Therefore, thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, behold, I will set my face against you for evil, and to cut off all Judah. I will take the remnant of Judah that have set their faces to go into the land of Egypt to sojourn there. They will all be consumed down there. They fall in the land of Egypt, consumed by the sword, by the famine. They shall die, from the least of them to the greatest. Verse 15. Then all the men that knew that their wives had burned incense unto other gods, and all the women that stood by, a great multitude, even all the people that dwell in the land of Egypt, answered Jeremiah, saying, okay, the men who knew what their wives had done, and bear in mind, there's more to this than burning incense. The men who knew what their wives had done hadn't said anything, and the women who had done these things, they all got together and they answered Jeremiah. Verse 16. As for the word that you have spoken to us in the name of the Lord, we will not listen to you. We will certainly do whatever thing goes forth out of our own mouth, to burn incense to the Queen of heaven, and to pour out drink offerings unto her, as we have done, we and our fathers, our kings, our princes in the cities of Judah. We're going to do just what we did there. We're going to do it down here. For then we had plenty to eat. We had plenty of water. We had no problems when we did that evil up there. So why should we listen to you? Since we left off to burn incense to the Queen of Heaven, ever since we stopped, which we already have the testimony that never did stop, we have wanted everything. We've been lacking. We've been consumed by the sword. And when we burned incense to the Queen of Heaven and poured out drink offerings to her, did we make her cakes to worship her and pour out drink offerings to her? Did we do that without our men? Oh, you know, the answer that comes through in this, the women are saying, what do you think? You think we did this without our men knowing it? And he's identifying the whole thing. Now, you know, when you read through this, it doesn't want to work logically at first. And I don't think it will work for you until you begin to grasp what underlay what they're talking about here. Because this was more than a matter of making hot cross buns. This was more than a matter of burning incense on some little old altar somewhere to some god and living your life the same way you always had lived it. No, not at all. Well, Jeremiah said to all the people, to the men, to the women that had given him that answer, this is verse 20. He said, the incense that you burned in the cities of Jerusalem, the streets of Jerusalem, you and your fathers, your kings, your princes, the people of the land, did not the Lord remember them, and did not it come into his mind? So he could no longer bear because of the evil of your doings, because of the abominations which you have committed. Therefore your land is a desolation, an astonishment, and a curse, and without inhabitant to this day. Now you've got to ask yourself, what happened? What else was there? What more is there in this that we're not giving consideration to, that these women did with the knowledge of their husbands, with the consent of their husbands, that Jeremiah, for whatever reason, isn't really spelling out? Verse 24, moreover, Jeremiah said to all the people, to all the women, listen to the word of the Lord, all Judah that are in the land of Egypt. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, saying, you and your wives have both spoken with your mouth and fulfilled with your hand, saying, we're going to go right ahead and perform the vows we've vowed. We're going to burn incense to the Queen of Heaven. We're going to pour out drink offerings to her, and you will surely accomplish your vows and perform your vows. Therefore hear the word of the Lord, all Judah that dwell in the land of Egypt. Behold, I have sworn by my great name, says the Lord, that my name shall no more be named in the mouth of any man of Judah in all the land of Egypt, saying, the Lord God lives. You're not going to be saying that anymore. Apparently they still were. They still swear by him. He says, this isn't going to be happening anymore. Why? Because there weren't going to be any of them. They were all going to die. He said, yet a small number that escaped the sword shall return out of the land of Egypt to the land of Judah. They'll get out of there. And all the remnant of Judah that have gone into the land of Egypt. Now, what on earth is this all about? And why is it such a very big deal? And why haven't we heard elsewhere about this Queen of Heaven? I don't know if you've ever looked in a concordance or not, but nobody talks about it except Jeremiah in those terms. But it would be a mistake to say that no one else talks about it. We have, for some reason, the old Bibles paper over it. In Exodus 34, for example, it depends on which translation you have in your lap there as to what you will see when you read this. In Exodus 34, God said to Israel, right from the get-go, "Take heed to yourself, lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land where you're going. Lest it be a snare in the midst of you, you shall destroy their altars, break down their images, and cut down their groves." What's a grove? We mean clear out. Normally we go clear out thickets, don't we? That's not a thicket. This is not just a gathering of trees. This is an Asherah. The word grove is the Hebrew word Asherah. He says, cut down their Asherah poles. Customary to take a pole, an upright pole, and carve it into the shape of a woman. The word translated groves is the Hebrew Asherah. He says, break down their altars in 34, verse 13. Smash their sacred stones. Cut down their Asherah poles. That's from the NIV. Cult prostitution is probably the oldest and surely the most persistent of all the ancient pagan customs. Now, people often refer to prostitution as the oldest profession, but what nobody ever really says about this is that it wasn't like it is today. It wasn't like the sort of thing you run into on street corners in some cities today where you have adult, grown women who are offering sex for money, or some places they call them sex workers. That's not what this was. That the reason it is the oldest profession is because it was coupled with religion right from the start. Prostitution was. It is a mixture of two of the most powerful influences on the human soul: sex and religion. Even now, right now as we speak, there's a manhunt going on from a religious leader that's created a cult that bartered little girls and, for all we know, little boys. He cut deals to provide little girls, underage girls, as wives, put wives in quotes if you care to some of the old men in his congregation out there in Colorado or Arizona, I think it was Arizona, that he was doing this. It was done under the rubric of polygamy, but it was more than that, because polygamy doesn't normally involve little boys. Religious prostitution is the practice of having sexual intercourse with a person other than one's spouse for a religious purpose. A woman engaged in such practices is sometimes called a temple prostitute or a hierodule in Greek, though modern connotations of the term prostitute cause interpretations of these phrases to be highly misleading. I'm reading now from an article on the Wikipedia online encyclopedia about cult prostitution. It was revered highly among Sumerians and Babylonians. In ancient sources, Herodotus, Thucydides, there are many traces of what they call hierosgamos, that is, holy wives, but the wives has to be in quote, starting perhaps with Babylon, where each woman had to reach once a year the sanctuary of Melita, Aphrodite, and there have sex with a foreigner as a sign of hospitality for a symbolic price. Now, in Israel, all your males are to get up and go to Jerusalem 3 times a year and present themselves before God and bring an offering toward God. In Babylon, all the women had to get up and go to a certain place and have sex with a stranger for a price, symbolically. A similar type of prostitution was practiced in Cyprus, in Corinth, in Greece, where a temple counted more than 1,000 prostitutes, according to Strabo. 1,000 of them. And you need to understand this about the Greeks. They would have been roughly 50-50 male and female. Now, returning to Jeremiah, because we want to underline something here, so I want you to be sure you understand the origins of this and the depths of it. Exodus 34, verse 12, where we were. Take heed to yourself, lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land where you're going, lest it be for a snare in the midst of you. You shall destroy their altars, break their images, cut down their Asherah. For you shall worship no other God, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. Lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and they go a whoring after their gods, to do sacrifice to their gods, and one calls you to it, and you eat of his sacrifice. Now, I really believe that the language and all that's going on here is somewhat cleaned up for our benefit. I think a lot of people, though, to take this expression, they go a-whoring after their gods in a figurative sense. I've heard this in the past where people say that since God was married to Israel, for Israel to go worship another god was to commit adultery against God. And therefore this was bad. You're being unfaithful to your God and so forth. And the adultery was in the form of bowing down to the god, burning incense to the god, going through what most people would consider very harmless little cultic practices. It suddenly dawned on me, thanks to Dan Brown and a few other sources I began to read, that when he uses this expression, they go a-whoring after their god, he was speaking literally. Because when they went after these gods, they went to them with all their incense, their drink offerings, and everything else that they did, and they had sex at these temples with people they didn't even know, as a part of a religious observance. Apparently, this is quite literal. Now, why would God hate this so much? Well, I want to read you something else that came from a website. It comes from the Anti-Slavery Society website on the web, just so you'll understand what we're talking about. Herodic child prostitution. Now, hieros is the word for temple, for some sort of a temple, and it's really a temple slave is what the word herodic means. Child prostitution, like this, is a generic term which the society uses to describe religiously sanctioned child prostitution, and specifically those children engaged in religious cult prostitution, known variously by different names which I can't even pronounce as he goes through them. It says, although there are differences between these ancient institutions of cult prostitution, essentially they all involve parents dedicating their little daughters to a Hindu deity. The reasons for dedication may differ. The dukis, they call them, were girls who were offered by their parents as a sacrifice to appease the gods, or were purchased from their parents by wealthy worshippers and offered to the gods. Now, we're not talking at this moment about offering them as burnt sacrifices and killing them. We're offering them to God for service in the temple. Historically, these girls served as temple slaves, sacred temple slaves, temple dancers, who were engaged by the priest to provide sexual service to male supplicants or male worshippers at the temple. Little girls. Not grown women who did this voluntarily. Little girls sold by their own parents to do this. However, nowadays, this original purpose is gone, and after dedication, usually at the age of 5 or 7 years of age, the child is often deflowered by the priest and then sold to the highest bidder. Did you catch the age? 5 to 7. He is sold to the highest bidder, who keeps her as his child concubine. When she grows older and loses the bloom of her youth, her buyer usually gets rid of her. The girl then has to work in a brothel, which often has a shrine at the door to symbolize her original dedication to Hindu cult prostitution. Now, this doesn't cross our minds that this sort of thing is still going on to this day. You probably can understand that there is a human sex slave traffic that goes on in the world purely as a monetary issue. It's hard to get our minds around the fact that it is still going on as a religious issue in some quarters. The British made efforts to suppress Herodic child prostitution in India. The Indian Penal Code 1860 made it a criminal offense to procure women or girls for that purpose. It was on the decline through the earlier part of the last century. However, there has been a recent revival of these institutions in Karnataka and Andhra Pradesh. Right on up into modern times, the practice continues. Now, why would we be surprised to think then that at the time the Israelites went into Canaan, that this practice of temple prostitution was going on? We know it was, from what we read in the Bible. What we don't tumble to, maybe because we're of our naivete, maybe because we don't have the historical background, and we just don't realize this, but when we sit down and we think it through, we will realize this is not grown adult women making this choice. It's little girls who are having the choice made for them. And in some societies, little boys too. Now, maybe you can get your mind around this a little further as to why God was incensed at the practice. Why He was furious at the practice. This was not just some harmless little thing that they were doing of offering little incense on an altar to a pagan god among a bunch of trees somewhere, and that was the end of it. Oh, no. That wasn't it. That sort of thing did go on in Israel at times past. And, the Bible says that some kings did a good job overall. They just didn't get rid of those things. But these things, cult prostitution, and as he puts the expression in a very blunt terms, going a whoring after their gods, he's speaking, I fear, literally. I get the impression that in all ages there has been a kind of slavery involving little girls and little boys. It hasn't been always the religion of the Hindus, but everywhere where the Asherah is worshipped. And in its own way, it creeps into our own society. Because even here, in a way, the Asherah is worshipped. So maybe when God says He hates, loathes, and despises this, calling it a going and whoring after other gods, we can understand why He was angry. We can understand why He was only willing to put up with it so long, and finally why He had to take stark, severe action to put an end to it. This is how the NRSV puts it. You shall not make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, for when they prostitute themselves to their gods and sacrifice to them, to their gods, someone among you them will invite you, and you will eat the sacrifice. I want you to understand something. Eating the sacrifice says rather more than having a steak with these people. I'm not going to go into that in any detail. I'll leave it for you to research it for yourself as to the evil extent to which this goes. Some aspects of this are just too vile for a sermon in which there are children present. I will simply tell you that the Da Vinci Code novel basically alleges that the Holy Grail is actually Mary Magdalene. I suspect this is of a piece with ancient customs that nobody wants to talk about. Now, people are beginning to, and maybe that's a good thing that we begin to face up to this. Then there's Judges, chapter 3, verse 5. So the children of Israel dwelt among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, all these ites that they were among. They took their daughters to be their wives. They gave their daughters to their sons. They served their gods with all that implies. And the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and forgot the Lord their God and served Baal and Asherah. Now, the combination of these two together is no coincidence. Asherah was Baal's consort. And in a way, Ahab taking Jezebel to be his wife is an apt comparison of the two. In 1 Kings chapter 14, Judah did evil in the sight of the Lord, and they provoked the Lord to jealousy with their sins they had committed above all that their fathers had done. They built high places and images and Asherah on every high hill, under every green tree. There were also male cult prostitutes in the land, and they did according to all the abominations of the nations which the Lord cast out from before the children of Israel. Now don't make any mistakes about this. This is not merely grown adult men engaging in consenting practices between consenting adults in private. If you imagine for a moment that they did not involve little boys, you just don't know the world around you. And maybe you should stay that way. They did according to all the abominations of the nations that were cast out before the children of Israel. And maybe now we can begin to understand why God said, drive these people out. Get rid of them. Destroy them. They have a choice. They can leave or die. And I am beginning to understand much more clearly than I ever did before why that was so. 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 30. Now Ahab the son of Omri did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him. He was the worst of the lot. It came to pass, as though it had been a trivial thing to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, that he took as a wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, the king of the Sidonians, and he went and served Baal and worshipped him. Set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal, which he built in Samaria. And Ahab made an Asherah. He did more to provoke the Lord of God to Israel to anger than all the kings of Israel who were before him. As I said, Ashtaroth was the female consort of every deity in the known world. And a temple to him and to her would have included the sacred feminine, which basically means the cult prostitute. and the practice of prostitution. You remember the incident on Mount Carmel when Ahab and Elijah really got crossways? 1 Kings chapter 18. It happened when Ahab saw Elijah that Ahab said to him, "Is it you, O troubler of Israel?" He said, "I haven't troubled Israel. You and your father's house have, in that you have forsaken the commandment of the Lord and followed the Baals. Now, therefore, send and gather all Israel to me on Mount Carmel, the 450 prophets of Baal, and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." Jezebel supported these women, maintained these women. Guess who they were? Now, King Josiah, later on, deals with this problem in 2 Kings 23. He did away with the pagan priests appointed by the kings of Judah to burn incense in the high places of the towns of Judah and around Jerusalem, 2 Kings 23. He took the Asherah pole from the temple of the Lord to the Kidron Valley. Now, that's a shocker when you think about it. I remember the first time I really tumbled to that, and I thought, what? They actually had set up this Asherah in the temple precincts of God. He goes on to say, he burned that thing down by the valley of Kidron. He ground it to powder and scattered the dust over the graves of the common people. He also tore down the cubicles of the male shrine prostitutes which were in the temple of the Lord, and where the women did weaving for Asherah. You know, that's really, when you get to this point, to where you have cult prostitution going on in the temple of God, and you wonder why on earth God got angry, why he was furious, why his anger rose up in his face, why the smoke came out of his nostrils, why he sold these people into captivity, because they had done precisely the same thing that all those people who were in the land before them had done, which got them killed, which destroyed their society. Now, this Asherah crops up again and again in the Bible. You can run it down easily enough on your own. If you've got a King James concordance, just look up groves, because that's where a grove or groves. Your computer Bibles make it a little easier to find. What is glorified in many of these things is the sacred feminine. It is nothing more than an ancient sex goddess who arranges selling of little boys and little girls as sex slaves. That's what it is. So you might as well know what it is. It preys on the weakest and the most helpless among us, and it's a powerful, powerful force for the destruction of marriage and of family, and finally of any society where it is. The novel, The Da Vinci Code, has resurrected the old goddess worship, the old sacred feminine, and the movie bids fair to push it even further down the road. But it really boils down to an excuse to justify satisfying one of the oldest cravings of man: sex without responsibility. It's what it's all about. It's breaking away from the constraints that God places upon man for the protection of women and for the protection of little children. Now, I'm not suggesting a boycott of the Da Vinci Code. I think you might do well to read the book. You might do well to see the movie. I have no idea about that. But what I want is for people to understand what the sacred feminine is all about. And a lot of the nonsense, the prattle that is in this book and other sources about the origins of the Christian faith and the origins and who won out in the war of religions is prattle. It's stupid and it's wrong. And I think it's important that we increasingly stand up in our society and call things what they are. God finally did so, even though delicately in many cases. Finally, he told the truth. He said, "You went a-whoring after your gods." Keep it up in our society, and it will destroy us.